I need to define what I mean by woke, which is actually something quite discrete, which is the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. That's woke. I don't think making a group sacred is a good idea. What we are facing now is a problem of political discrimination. People in filter bubbles who don't ever encounter the other opinion. Now, where are those filter bubbles most extreme now? I think I would argue that highly educated liberals live in some of the most politically homogenous environments. Here in Britain, we've had, there was a woman who was a young mother who has been thrown in jail for 31 months for a tweet, which she later deleted and apologized for.
Am I a denier? Am I a genocide denier?
I mean, Canada is the place that's lost its mind the most on this. There was this claim, there's 215 Indigenous children buried in the graveyard in this school, this mass grave. Somebody claimed through some ground-penetrating radar to have seen these disturbances or whatever. The long and the short of it is there are no bodies there. There were no parents looking for missing kids at the school, which you might have expected if they kind of went missing. This thing's basically like a Pizzagate level hoax, but this is a hoax that has been endorsed by all the major political parties, all the mainstream media, except for the right-wing paper called The National Post.
All right, everybody. It's Michael Shermer, and it's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show. My guest today is Eric Kaufmann. He's a professor of politics and director of the Center for Heterodox Social Science. As opposed to what? Well, we'll find out. At the University of Buckingham in England. He's also adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute in New York City. He's written for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Times of London, Newsweek, National Review, New Statesman, Financial Times, and other outlets. He's the author of many books, including White Shift, Populism, Immigration, and the Future of White Majorities in 2018. Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth in 2010? I'm going to say no. But I haven't read that book, so we'll see. The Orange Order in 2007. I have no idea what that's about. Maybe we'll find out. And The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America in 2004. And here's the new book, The Third Awakening, not Awakening, Awakening, a 12-point plan for rolling back progressive extremism. Hey, Eric, thanks for coming on to talk to the group here. We met in Buckingham, actually, at your conference. How did you feel it went?
Yeah, I've been sort of bowled over, really blown away by all the positive comments from those who attended. And it was great to have you over there as a speaker as well. And yeah, I thought I was very pleased with the energy. And we're going to be hopefully harnessing that for the next steps in this project.
Yeah, your 12-point plan is like it's like AA. I was once woke.
I hadn't thought of it that way.
I've once woke, but I've stopped being woke.
Right. Yeah, I like it. I like it. It's a struggle session over getting rid of your innate wokery, right?
That's right. Well, we're going to get into that in a second, but give us a little a background. What's your story? How'd you get into all this stuff?
Well, I mean, okay, so I've been an academic for 25 years, and one thing, one aspect of, I've had sort of three interests, and one of them has always been the cultural left. I've always been interested in the cultural left. Now, in my first book, that was mainly going into the 19th and early 20th, mid-20th century. But in my most recent book, I kind of take that story forward from the 1960s into the present, which is, I think, really the story of our period is the dominance of a kind of cultural form of the left. So this is one of my research areas, along with demographic shifts and how they affect politics, and then this question of nationalism and particularly ethnic majorities. So those are sort of three areas I've been researching for 30 years, I guess you could say. And so really the book, The Third Awakening, there are plenty of strands in there that go back to my first book, actually. But clearly there's been a lot of new material. So I can say I was studying woke before it was fashionable.
Yeah. Before you were woke, you were studying woke, before there was such a thing. How would you describe yourself politically?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting question. I do certainly see myself as conservative, but on many issues, I don't have a conservative view, and that could be, could be climate change, could be religion, could be, and even on tax and spend, I'm kind of, I don't have a huge problem with a certain amount of redistribution in the welfare state. So it depends on the issue. But I guess when it comes to culture wars, when it comes to immigration, those would be issues I would align more with the right, definitely. And today, those are kind of very important defining issues for where you situate yourself. Now, having said that, obviously there are many strands of the right. And, I use this term rational populist. So I'm very attracted to, like you are, to this idea of scientific reason and falsifiability and scientific method and evidence and having a rational debate, a rational society, civil discourse. At the same time, I think there is some truth in populism in the sense that established institutions and procedures and processes do sometimes become self-justifying and do sometimes need to have outsiders to shake them up and question them, although without tearing them down. So it's a kind of fine line. We need a certain amount of shaking up of the system, which can become overly responsive to special interests, for example, as opposed to the general population. But at the same time, we can't throw out the baby of classical liberalism, if you like, with the bathwater of preserving institutions or reforming institutions. So I think that's sort of where I am in this debate, which kind of means that I find myself between a number of different camps who are often quite bitterly contesting things.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a changing landscape since MAGA kind of took over the Republican Party, at least here in the States. Conservatism has changed. But in England, the original Burkean conservatism, Edmund Burke, made a distinction between the American Revolution that was, done based on rational principles and here's a list of our grievances and so on and so forth and retain all the old institutions that work and let's revise the ones that don't work, as opposed to the French Revolution, which was just tear it all down, cut off their heads, and let's start over. And so you're obviously of the first camp, and I guess that's kind of where conservatism as an intellectual movement starts.
It's really tricky because, maybe there are some bad laws that should be just torn. If you think about Jim Crow laws or, they're clearly the Nuremberg law. I mean, there are clearly some laws which should just be torn down. There are some bad institutions. But yeah, I think I would agree that reform. Now, Burkean, the idea of very slow, the question, I think this is a question of speed. How quickly, how radically do we reform and which institution do we reform? So I think a lot of these questions are really about optimums and rather than one or the other. So I wouldn't say I'm always going to be opposed to tearing something down, but generally my inclination would be to reform the kind of Chesterton fence approach, which says there's probably a reason for it to be there. But this doesn't mean you can't, it may be that the European, so something like the European Union, I think needs to be drastically reformed, but I didn't vote to leave, for example, in Britain, but I can understand those who did. Countries have a right to enter and leave trade agreements. And so I'm not opposed to that, but yeah, I think the value of institutions is worth at least taking a hard look at.
Yeah. Well, the reason I ask is because if you do have a conservative reputation, then people are going to read your book and go, oh, well, what do you expect? He's a conservative. That's why he would say that. He's not being fair to the woke progressives, or he hasn't properly steel-manned their argument. So when you read a, say, woke progressive author, how do you kind of set aside your own politics and say, well, I'm going to give this argument a fair shot?
Yeah, I think that's a great approach. I think we should give every argument a fair shot. And I guess it depends. First of all, I need to define what I mean by woke, which is actually something quite discrete, which is the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. That's woke. So I don't think making a group sacred is a good idea. Now, we can have a debate over whether there is inequality, whether there's privilege. All of these things are worth thinking about. So I'd say the kind of milder versions of these arguments are worth thinking about. So, for example, something that is scientifically grounded is that they have done sort of resume studies where they'll send out a whole bunch of resumes to different businesses, and the callback rates are higher generally for whites than they are for a range of other groups, not not the blacks don't necessarily get the worst of it. It's actually probably more Muslim and non-Christian groups that probably get worse discrimination, but that's hard evidence, and I could be convinced by that. Now, I think there's a whole bunch of questions that one needs to ask about the methodology of those studies, but I think it's a fair thing. Whereas if someone says, we live in a white supremacist society, there's structural racism, and there are all these mysterious structures of whiteness and white privilege you can't see and touch and measure and falsify, then I'm not convinced by that. I would say that's it's kind of a conspiracy theory or even a blood libel unless you allow us a way to measure and falsify. So that's the kind of distinction, but I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt if they can provide me a measure, something concrete, a way in which I can falsify and test the veracity of their argument. Absolutely.
Yeah, let me comment on the resume callback thing. I don't know about the race part of it, but the gender or sex part of it has now changed or been refuted or wasn't replicated or whatever. Stephen Cece's done the heavy lifting on this of massive studies on resumes with obvious female names are not discriminated against. In fact, they have a slight favorability in academia anyway, for sure. So that's not the case anymore. Maybe that's changed. It could be that, in the 70s and 80s, there was a bias, but it's not anymore. This idea of progress is real, I think. And part of the victimhood status is to say, well, we were victims then, so maybe we still are now. What's your evidence? Well, any kind of inequalities that are measurable in, I don't know, house ownership or income or, health outcomes or whatever, if there's black-white or black-white Asian differences or whatever, they can only be attributed by culture. And therefore the solution is to, have a heavy-handed government program that redistributes things to equalize it. So in the United States, you'd have to have 14% senators have to be black or 14% CEOs have to be black or whatever. So there, the shift has happened, and maybe you could comment on why this happened and when, from equality of opportunity to equality of outcomes.
Yeah, I think you put your finger on an absolutely a couple of crucial points. I just want to address what you said about things changing over time, because it's always possible to go back in the past and say, hey, look, black people weren't allowed to use the same water fountains and they had to go through the back door and sit in the back. I mean, that's all true. The problem is you have to prove in the present that discrimination is occurring. And what often happens is when you get into these debates with critical theorists, they'll always go back into the past and they'll always start with a big, long historical diatribe. I mean, look, that was true. Now, it was true of Catholics and Jews too. And I don't think that they're making a claim now that anti-Catholicism is still occurring in the C-suites. So things fade away. And that's just not an argument that critical social justice folks are willing to entertain. It's always there. And as long as there's any kind of disparity in terms of wealth gap and income gap, disparity, as you say, the argument is disparities equals discrimination. And that's what's known as a form of reasoning. You're measuring the cause and as the effect and vice versa. Now, yeah, and we've had progress. We have, the problem is this move to equal. So you talk about the equal opportunity to equal result. When did that shift happen? One of my claims is that shift is not as new as we sometimes think. So some people think, everything was fine up until 10 years ago, 2010. And then we just took this wrong turn and now we're coming back to normal. And I think that's actually a mistaken analysis. If you go back to the affirmative action executive order of President Johnson that Trump rescinded recently, which I think is an excellent move, by the way, to rescind that order. I mean, that order essentially set up a whole architecture of goals and timetables that led to the equal outcomes regime. And if you read Johnson's 1965 Howard University speech, he talks about we don't want just, people at the same starting line. We want equal results. And I think really that the context of that was urban rioting, starting with the Watts riots, really created a climate in which they had to show equal results of some kind. And I think once that mindset was set in the late 1960s, it proved impossible to unwind and has only become deeper and deeper. So the errors, I think, go back 60 years with affirmative action, and also with this disparate impact, this idea if you have a test and, male firemen do better than female firemen, or Asians do better than blacks and Hispanics on an SAT, then somehow the test is racist. And this disparate impact standard has become, again, another part of the civil rights law. Again, I would applaud Trump going after that and trying to and that goes back to 1971, again, over 50 years ago. So I think there were errors that were already being accumulated in the system 50, 60 years ago, and those have really just accelerated during the last 10 years to the point where now people realize, actually, we've got to overturn this entire equal outcomes thing and get back to equal opportunities.
Yeah. I should point out that Thomas Sowell makes the argument, not just him, but Shelby Steele and a few other conservative Black scholars, that Blacks, in fact, were on track of catching up with equal outcomes to whites in the 1940s and 50s and into the early 60s, home ownership, marriage rates, et cetera, et cetera. It wasn't perfect, but it was, a progress. And then the Great Society kind of reversed that. That's the conservative argument. But let's just set that aside for a second. Just take Johnson's argument. The moment you set up a government program that says, well, we have really screwed these people over and we're gonna make it right now. Okay. How do you know if it's working or not? Well, you have to measure everything you possibly can, and including having people tick off the boxes of what color they are. And so that, now we have this whole race-based system. There's a kind of logic to it, because what else are you going to do if you're cutting checks to people or setting up programs to hire more people based on certain groups? You got to know who you're doing this with, and then did it work in the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, or whatever. So I think that's in part kind of an internal logic to it, why we ended up discontinuing it. And I'm always asking, liberals that still favor this, when do you know that you've made it? And we don't need it anymore. And the answer is when we have perfect, equal outcomes. It's like, but Thomas Sowell shows that will never happen anywhere between any two groups of any kind. It could be Yankee fans and Red Sox fans. They're not going to be equal. Whatever's going on behind the scenes, who knows? But that's just not realistic.
Well, yeah, and this gets to one of the problems, which is that, at the core of the woke belief system, first of all, making these minorities sacred, but secondly, a philosophy that says equal outcomes and emotional harm protection for these groups is the highest value in the system. So anything less than what I would call cultural socialism, economic socialism is perfect equality between individuals and classes economically. This is perfect equality between identity groups. It's just as utopian and it's just as unrealistic. Groups rise and fall over time. There are groups that didn't do well. If you were to go back to the early 20th century, the Irish and the Italians would have been at the bottom, and groups rise. The Germans at one time were seen as kind of a backward group in Europe, and then they gradually industrialized, and so groups kind of rise and fall to some degree over time. But there's no ability in this system to see that. It's just got to be immediately equal. And it's kind of equal at every stage. And yet, so what's interesting is sometimes the inequalities. So, for example, if you don't throw bad behaving pupils out of the classroom and bad behaving citizens in jail, you make the class environment worse. You make your neighborhood worse. That's going to drag down the more aspirational, let's say African Americans or indigenous, talking about the Canadian case. And that's going to mean fewer applicants to the Ivy League because they'll be held back because they were in a class with disruptive pupils. So you kind of have to have a bit of, you may need to go through a period where, you may have a disproportionate number of Black kids being excluded from class, being in jail. But actually what that might do is help the group average to rise. And that's just, again, that's not something that a woke progressive can face, because they want to see perfect equality in everything all the time. Sometimes equalities go against each other. So you need maybe some inequality in incarceration and education in order to get more equality in terms of wealth. But these kinds of subtleties and nuances, there's no room for it. It's just a very broad brush doctrinaire belief in perfect equality, perfect representation.
Yeah, but if you flip the valence and say, well, okay, how come the number one predictor of violence is maleness? That doesn't seem fair. It's like 99% of all death row inmates are men. Okay. We got to get the women up there. Come on. Anyway.
Yeah, and it's only certain things that are sacred in the system, right? I mean, we don't, it may be that people with low IQ, in fact, it is the case that people of lower IQ are disproportionately behind bars.
Mm-hmm.
We don't yet have a system. I know there have been some dystopian novels. So Lionel Shriver's Mania, or I think it was Kurt Vonnegut's Handicapper General. Those were all, they were talking about a world in which, if you had a cognitive advantage, if you were athletic or good looking, you would need to be penalized and handicapped down to the average. We don't do that. We don't actually care about IQ. We don't care about looks and athleticism and the advantages that go with that. You could imagine a cultural leftist system that did care about those things and tried to equalize on those grounds. So what is interesting about woke cultural socialism is that it's focused on race, gender, sexual orientation as the key things that must be perfectly equal, whereas it's ignoring a bunch of other dimensions which are probably more important: class, IQ, for example, looks, these other things which may be more important for privilege and success, which aren't part of the ideological belief system. So that's just kind of, despite fat, body positivity, which I define as outside woke, by the way, even though, yes, there are family resemblances, the fat studies movement, I don't include it actually within woke, because I think woke's central, the things you will get canceled for, the things you have to virtue signal about are basically race, sex and gender, sexual orientation and gender. Those are the key trinity.
Yeah. In my very first Substack column, right after my Scientific American series ended, I wrote about an article in Scientific American claiming that math and STEM in general have a misogyny problem. And, of course, they have data. They go, look, there aren't 50% women in all these different fields, math and engineering, physics, and so on. Anyway, so it wasn't hard to look up, bachelor rates, doctoral rates, employment rates, and so on of other fields, education and nursing and medical doctor, even lawyers now, I think, and the psychological side, social sciences, linguistics, on and on and on. It's hugely dominant women. So does anybody conclude that those fields have I don't know what you'd call it, a anti-misogyny bias against men? No, no one thinks that. They recognize, well, there's just different interests. Men are not as interested as women are in some of these fields, and vice versa, but never vice versa for STEM. Why is that?
Yeah, because the groups that are sacred are the historically disadvantaged groups, and the groups that are seen as the oppressors and therefore the fallen, those who've committed the sin, the original sin in the system, are the dominant ones, whites and men, and therefore they will never get any consideration. I kind of had this talk when I was considering this term woke right. Could you imagine, in a world where whites and men fell right to the bottom for generations, could you ever imagine leftist sympathy eventually moving over to whites and men? I think it's not inconceivable at some long point in the future. In India, the Muslims used to be the dominant group for many generations, many years. Even under the British, they still had a pretty high status. But since the independence of India, they've kind of become more second class. So they've now attracted the sympathies of the left. But there's perhaps an example of a group that's gone from a group that would have been seen as a dominant oppressor to a subaltern oppressed group. And I'm trying to think of some other examples of where that might have been the case. Maybe in Rwanda, the Tutsis, they got massacred. So even though they were the dominant group, now, okay, they've been attacked. So perhaps in some theoretical world, whites and men could become the oppressed. But that's certainly not the case now.
How about, I just thought of, what about Jews or Israel in general, I guess, pre-1948? I think people had a different view of Jews than they do now because they're successful and have a successful country and pour out Nobel Prizes and technological innovations and nuclear weapons and so on. Now they're the oppressor rather than the oppressed for the last 4,000 years before that.
That's a really it's a really good point. I was going to mention something about that, but yeah. So I think there's a tension there because there's still the accusation of, oh, you're a Nazi, you're a fascist. So it's still the anti-Semitism taboo still has some power, but equally at the same time, Jews are now being located, in whiteness and settler colonialism, particularly in Israel, and therefore as an part of the oppressor of the West. So they're kind of in a curious intermediate zone. I mean, one kind of test I would, one question I want to sort of raise is, if you imagine if Jews were to claim that increases in tax represent a form of systemic racism, because there's a disparate impact of tax rises on the wealthy and Jews are disproportionately wealthy, would we say that a tax increase is systemically biased against Jews, right? That's the kind of logic of disparate impact, is that any law which has a disparate impact on a particular group, which is deemed to be oppressed, is ipso facto seen as indirectly racist. So yeah, that's the one I always like, is a tax increase as being a form of anti-Semitism.
Yeah. Okay, let's look at history. So your book is called The Third Awakening. What were the first two?
Yeah, so one of the key points of my books really is that the Great Awakening, if you like, of the early 2010s up until the early 2020s, that decade, that's only the first of three awakenings, and the ideas are in fact go back much earlier. So the first one, I would say, was the late 1960s. We had some cancellations, for example, the Moynihan Report into the Black Family for the Johnson administration. Daniel Patrick Moynihan's report was worried about rising fatherlessness amongst African Americans. And at that time, only 1/3 of Black families were headed by a single mother, which nowadays you'd think would be fantastic. I mean, whites are kind of at that level or even below that now. So he kind of sounded the alarm, and that was seen as too contentious. And so the report was shelved. So that's what I mean. That was the first example of a kind of cancellation because of racial sensitivities. We also had irrational emotional hostage taking. You had sit-ins and demonstrations at universities demanding, the University of, I think it was San Francisco State University, or they had a demonstration, and they struck for a year, and they said, we want 50 Black professor positions. We want any Black student to be admitted. We want this. They made all these demands, and many of those demands were caved into by the administration. You had, of course, Cornell, you had the Black Panthers, and you had other groups occupying buildings, disorderly conduct. A lot of the things that we see in the 2010s and 2020s were happening in the late 60s. The emphasis on irrationality, on essentially turning your brain off, yelling and screaming, occupying, everything's about emotions, anti-intellectual. And what's interesting is even, Theodor Adorno, one of the original critical theorists, used this term left-wing fascists to describe the students who would simply walk on stage and occupy and prevent him from speaking. And that's it kind of tells us something, that the origins of the, this heckler, this kind of no platform attitude, emotion over reason, that was already there in the late 60s. Now, the second awakening, I'd say, is the late 80s, early 90s. When I first entered university, we had political correctness, hey-ho, Western Civ has got to go, Eurocentric, dead white males. This was sort of a second wave. Like the first wave, race was a key feature. Sex was kind of, or feminism, radical feminism was already there in the first wave in the late 60s, but certainly in the second wave. That's very big. Gender studies, already in the 1980s, you had accounts of gender studies programs, feminist study, and the kind of the way those seminars were conducted, the kind of emotional blackmail that was used the way civil discourse, Socratic discourse was out the window. It's all very reminiscent of today. So I would say the difference between that political correctness, second awakening, and the current is that it remained largely on campus or in the pages of a few magazines, like the New Republic, which was critical. I mean, the magazines were generally critical. You had people like Francis Fukuyama and Nathan Glazer, and others who were, classical liberals who were very much critical of political correctness. But actually, this thing did not die off in 1991. It continued. And it had a very sharp resurgence in the 2010s. The same ideas. It's the sacredness of race, sacredness of sex, and sacredness of sexual minorities. Those are the common themes in all three awakenings. And I don't think you would have the third awakening without the second, without the first. So it's simply a quantitative step change. And we can sort of track that. I do that in the book by looking at big data. The term racism, if you look at the frequency of the use of the term racist or sexist, the first uptick is in the late 60s. Then it flattens. And then you have another surge in the late 80s, early 90s, settles out. And then another surge in the 2010s and 20s, which is our current period. One difference is that if you took the mainstream media like New York Times, you didn't see the awakenings in the New York Times. New York Times was pretty much still largely fact-based, not so ideological. It's only in the 2010s that the third awakening that really breaks off campus, hits the media, explodes through the press. The press converges with academia. So really our awakening is really about a convergence between what's going on campus and the mainstream media. As Andrew Sullivan says, we all live on campus now.
That's such a great example. Yeah, I think back of other examples, like when Ed Wilson's book, Sociobiology, was published in 1976, same year as Dawkins' The Selfish Gene. And, Richard and Ed are both pretty liberal, at least old school liberals. That they were smeared with these accusations of being racist and eugenicists and so on. Pinker has a poster of a protest, call for protesters to march on Ed Wilson's lecture hall. And
really?
It even says in there, bring noisemakers.
Yeah. I mean, Nathan Glazer was talking in 1969 about how the free speech movement at Berkeley eventually became anti-free speech, and that the problem was actually allowing professors to research what they want, people to come onto campus. So he was already kind of talking about the problems that were just emerging in that wave, and very much, this is really what we're living through. We're living through the same logic, and this is one of the reasons I think we now are being forced to confront, because this was kind of confined to the campus. They could have the first two awakenings. Everyone else ignored it. It didn't decide elections. It didn't really break very strongly into the mass media or public consciousness. Now it has. Now culture wars and woke really is in the public consciousness in a big way. And that's, I think, an encouraging sign as well, because I think what it means is we're now going to have to take a hard look at the paradigm that was laid down in the late 60s with the student revolts, with the riots, with the new social movements of identity groups. There's a questioning of, that was kind of seen as the way forward. This is inevitably the direction of history, and you've got to be on the right side of it. And I think now I'm quite hopeful in some sense that at the elite level, people realize this has gone too far. It's not the truth with a capital T. And I think that creates the possibility of an opening and of a change. And I'm quite optimistic about that.
Yeah. One other addendum to the Ed Wilson story. After he died, the New York Review of Books, of course, ran an article saying that, he was secretly a racist. And it's like, oh, yeah? Okay. How do you know this? Well, because he supported this guy, Philippe Rushton. Well, so Philippe Rushton was this Canadian biologist.
I know. I remember he spoke on my university campus.
Oh, he did? Oh, I bet that was controversial. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he argued
in the 90s,
about the, race group differences in IQ. But he went further than that. He also had a whole thing on R selection versus K selection in species. Now, R selection species are just R for rapid. These are like salmon that have a whole bunch of babies and pay
Right.
next to no resources to any one of them. But the law of large numbers, you're going to get at least some adult breeding pairs at the end of the road there. Versus K-selected like elephants, you just have one or two and you put all your resources. Well, so humans are K-selected. But then he argued that within human groups, there's differences in how KRR selected you are. And some people have more babies indiscriminately than others. And here's where it becomes politically incorrect, where he said, the blacks have more babies and they're less discriminating than whites and Asians even more. And then he one last move that was almost comical. It's almost like a Babylon Bee thing, where he had a theory on different penis sizes. Blacks have larger penises, Asians have the smallest penises, whites in the middle. And he claims he got this data from condom companies who apparently have data on where they sell the large, medium, and small condoms. And the Asians
I vaguely
buy more
remember
small
that.
ones. Anyway, but what Ed was defending Rushton for is just the opportunity to speak about it. Like, he should not be censored. Just put it out there, publish the data, and let's have at it. Why is he wrong? But no, the criticism at the time is he should be fired. He should not be published. These ideas should not be dispersed or even discussed. And that's all Ed was arguing for, which of course is the totally liberal thing to do.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are two real aspects of this woke cultural socialism. And the first is equal outcomes, which we've talked about. But the second is this emotional safety, emotional harm protection, self-esteem protection for minority groups. And here, if you take the equal outcomes part of it, that attacks, equal treatment, merit, non-discrimination. The emotional harm protection part of it attacks free speech and the pursuit of truth. So if you can't, if your science will offend somebody, or even offend the most sensitive member of a historically marginalized group, you can't do it. So this puts limits on science, on freedom of inquiry, on freedom of expression. And yeah, I mean, this is the other prong of it, which has been going, as you say, for quite some time. This is not an entirely new development. Now, of course, all these things have gotten worse because we had social media with a like button, and you could get dog piles as people just press the like button. Or maybe you could have, we've got a new kind of media. I think Batya Ungar Sargon in her book Bad News makes this point. The media went from a classified ads model to a clickbait model where driving emotions and virality on social media is what gets you revenue. So again, these factors all magnified the problem. But I still think the core of the problem was already there. It was bad ideas, which privileged making sacred particular groups and allowing emotion to trump reason. That's really the origin of this.
Yeah.
It starts in the 60s.
Yeah.
So I'll always say that this is not a new problem, but it's accelerated. But I think in some ways the acceleration has maybe done us a service because it's kind of made it so ridiculous. It's gone off the campus. People can't ignore it. So it's now affecting elections. It is helping to elect Ron DeSantis and Glenn Youngkin and Donald Trump. And clearly, if we look at public opinion, as I do in the book, these issues all break about 2-1 on average against the woke position in the public. And so if the Democratic Party wants to run on providing access to gender reassignment surgery for minors, that's going to be a big vote loser. And in an attack ad, that's going to really make a difference. And I think that's a good thing because these issues need to enter into political contestation. And this is one of the reasons that, the cultural left will always try and keep those issues below the surface so that they can be handled behind closed doors in the institutions of, whether it be government or universities or schools. As long as they're in those institutions and they're shielded from public view and awareness, they can get away with a cultural revolution. Once they break into electoral politics, that will be a discipline that will start to sort of push back on this.
Yeah. That's my favorite ad in the last election campaign was Donald Trump's about Kamala Harris. She's for they, them. He's for you.
Right.
That was so effective.
Right. Yeah. But it was such an own goal for all the Democrats had to do. So in Britain, for example, the the left-wing party, the Labour Party, has actually really backed away from trans activist causes. And they've said, yes, a woman is is an adult human female. They've really had to sort of cut loose that part of the coalition in order to survive. But my sense in the U.S. is the Democrats are still hanging on to, they haven't yet cut that cord. I think they probably are going to have to. It depends how close the polling is, but that's going to be a luxury they probably can't afford.
All right, I got a funny story to tell you about the Philippe Rushton thing because you'll know some of the players. Anyway, one thing we cover a lot at Skeptic is UFOs and more recently the UAPs. And all these people have books out, of course, and I try to get them on the show and no one will come on and talk to me. And I finally got Nick Pope to come on. He was at one time, he worked for the Department of Defense or whatever you call it in England for them, in charge of their kind of, what are the weird things in the sky? Because we should know about this. So he was part of that. Anyway, you see him all the time now on the Ancient Aliens and media whenever there's a UAP report. So, and he's a super, super rational guy. He's very properly skeptical, I would say. And he's willing to talk to me. So he comes on. Anyway, so we went through all that. Then we start talking about, free speech and these sorts of things. He said, well, you should talk to my wife about that. Well, who's your wife? Elizabeth Weiss. I went, okay, never heard of her. Oh, she's an archaeologist at San Jose State. And this was at the time she was still there, but having a lawsuit. She was sanctioned by them for handling the skeletal remains incorrectly and for objecting to repatriation, that is reburying remains before they could be studied by scientists. Anyway, I thought, yeah, that would be an interesting topic. So I bring her on and we're talking about all this stuff and how she had been sanctioned. And she had some funny stories about you cannot you can't sex a skeleton based on, say, the pelvis, which is obviously either male or female in human remains that are thousands of years old, because we don't know how they would have identified thousands of years ago as male or female. So, oh my God, that was the most ridiculous story. But there were lots like that. Anyway, then we started talking about why some of this is sensitive. And I brought up the Philippe Rushton story with Ed Wilson and all that stuff. And she says, oh, I know all about that. I said, oh, you do? How so? She says, I was married to Philippe Rushton. I went, what? Oh, my God.
I know.
It's like, all right, tell me more. Was he a racist? I mean, it's pillow talk. He must have said, oh, the blacks are like this or what. No, she says, not at all. It's like, okay, all right.
Yeah, I mean, look, some people are their minds just work in a different direction, but I remember because I met her as well and found that out. And so I was curious because I was an undergrad at the time and I wasn't interested in these things much, at that time. I was just being an undergrad. And so, but this debate happened on the campus. And if I look back on it, I mean, I'm astounded because that wouldn't happen now. So on the one hand, you could say, well, back in 1990 or whenever that debate happened, clearly there was enough residual or vestigial belief in free speech that this debate could occur. So on the one hand, you might say, okay, fine, there is something different between our current awakening and back then. But I think the difference was simply that the cultural left wasn't mobilized. I mean, if they had been mobilized, I don't actually think anyone would have stood up to them. If they really had said, no, we're going to shut this down, this is unacceptable. And I kind of think they might have prevailed because there are other stories of similar antics occurring and the cultural left running riot in the early 90s. An example was the University of British Columbia Political Science Department was completely paralyzed by non-specific allegations of racism and sexism that would not pinned to any one individual. And they got in this high-priced consultant who was paid hundreds of thousands, and at the end, the thing turned into a complete fiasco. But it just shows that there was already these doors were already open if you knew where to push. It's just that there were fewer activists. They weren't connected by social media. So I do think there's really a continuity of ideas here. And really, we need to tackle the entire edifice that has just been building for decades and decades. And I think this is one reason why, if you look at Trump's war on universities, the DEI bit and the curtailing of DEI, there's actually not tremendous pushback from, the media or universities on this. I mean, yes, they are pushing back against Trump cutting science funding, cutting foreign aid, the sort of obvious stuff. But when it comes to the kind of culture war stuff, my sense is there's not actually a tremendous amount of outrage over over the cuts that are being made to this. And so I kind of take that as a signal of progress, that actually people realize this all was a bit ridiculous. So, yeah, I mean, and similarly, when we talk about misinformation and hate speech, these are sort of the rationales for more recent clampdowns on free speech online harms bills in various countries like Ireland and Britain and Canada and elsewhere. The evidence base is extremely weak again. This idea that somehow if you allow people to express these opinions, that will lead to violence against minority groups. I mean, it's possible to do those studies. You can measure the number of these statements online. You can measure number of hate crime convictions or violence against minority groups. That kind of patient empirical evidence is lacking, basically. And I'm not a free speech absolutist. If someone were to say, allowing people to say this definitely or has a high probability of leading to a significant number of people experiencing hate crime or being killed or whatever, then we can have a conversation. I mean, you can see the example in the U.S. case with people trying to shoot Donald Trump or this Minnesota assassination. Does this mean that, partisan hate should be banned because we have a few political assassinations? Again, it's very difficult to be able to pin a particular attack on a politician down to any particular piece of partisan hate. Maybe it's an ingredient, but we sort of I think we have to allow that, speech has we don't know what all the effects of speech are going to be. We have to put up with a certain amount of danger. It's like COVID or any other pandemic. At some point you have to allow people out. At some point you can't have a speed limit of 2 miles an hour. We accept the price of freedom is a certain amount of danger. And I think the same with free speech. So I'm not against, I'm trying to think of an example, like, for example, is copycat suicides, not publicizing suicides. It may be the case that there is a very clear cause and effect there, so you shouldn't publicize those suicides. But again, I would always want to see the evidence, and that's almost always lacking. If you really dig into the studies and justifications, it's always meta-theoretical, and it's poor bivariate kind of analysis.
Yeah. After January 6th, I talked to a number of First Amendment scholars who said it's a pretty high bar to reach, saying something like, we're going to be strong and let's all march down there and peacefully protest, but be strong. They're stealing our democracy. Yeah, that sounds pretty inflammatory, and look what happened. But did that actually incite the violence? These First Amendment scholars said you probably could not press that in court.
Yeah, whereas here in Britain, we've had, there was a woman who was a mother, a young mother who has been thrown in jail for 31 months for a tweet, which she later deleted and apologized for. I mean, that's the state of things in Britain. Now, part of this is that we have wrought in the civil service something called the Crown Prosecution Service that this, I don't know if it's like a district attorney, but where they have decided which cases to prosecute, and they sort of advise this woman to plead guilty, and she did. So it's very hard to undo that. But the long and the short of it is, this attitude, that, oh, well, there's all this misinformation and hate speech, so we have to clamp down on free speech. That seems to be being pushed quite significantly by sections of the administrative state, and certainly by progressive political parties across Europe. It's really quite a negative trend. I think in Britain it's being resisted, and in Canada it's being resisted, but it's definitely a fight because you don't have a First Amendment that can really protect you.
Can you affirm that this is really happening? Because when I bring up these examples of people getting arrested for tweets and things like that, and I'm told by my liberal friends, oh, that's just a right-wing moral panic. There's just a couple of isolated incidents. It's not really that big a deal. Is it? It really is happening?
Oh, it absolutely is happening, and I think the numbers are in the thousands. There's also something in Britain called non-crime hate incidents, where you may not be charged, but you can have something recorded against your name, which is called you didn't commit a crime, but you had committed a non-crime hate incident. That is, somebody subjectively reported you. And what that means is when you then go to get checked, if you want to work with children or if you want to get a job, they can dig this up on your record. And so there have been several 100,000 of these non-crime hate incidents issued, and they have not been rescinded yet. Now, there's a left-wing government in Britain. It's kind of squeaked through because the right was divided into several parties. But it's worth saying that, yes, there is a climate of fear around this in Britain and in other European countries. Yes, is it something that I worry about every day? No. I mean, but it means, you can be picked off. So you don't have that cast iron guarantee. So there's a chill on speech that wouldn't be there as much in the U.S. case.
Yeah, in the case of the Holocaust denial in Canada, it's illegal as a form of hate speech. Okay, so there's a debate about how many Native Americans died due to European colonization in Canada and the United States. Well, how many were here before Columbus? Okay, well, 100 million, 10 million, 50 million, whatever. And then how many died? It was 90%, 50%. So
right.
What if I erred on the side? I'm a scholar, let's say I err, and I think it's only 50%. And I think it was only 10 million, not 100 million. Am I a denier? Am I a genocide denier?
Well, I mean, Canada is the place that's lost its mind the most on this, I would say. So there's something more concrete even than contact and pre-contact. That there's basically the Native Indian residential school system, which was basically these were a set of schools that were set up in remote areas where Aboriginal students. Usually I'd say maybe about 30% of them would go to one of these schools where they'd have to travel, I don't know, maybe a day or whatever to get there from these very remote reservations. The charge is that a quote unquote genocide took place at these residential schools that were run by, churches or parachurch organizations. The reality, if you look at death rates, the death rates, essentially all the deaths occurred due to tuberculosis and other diseases. The reality is the death rates in these residential schools were considerably lower than on reserve or in reserve schools, but they were higher than in the white schools. And so one of the charges is, okay, well, and then you had a number of entrepreneurs claiming all these lurid tales about children being thrown in incinerators. And anyway, there's basically no evidence whatsoever for any of this. What happened at this school, there was this claim, there's 215 Indigenous children buried in the graveyard in this school, this mass grave. Somebody claimed through some ground penetrating radar to have seen these disturbances or whatever. The long and the short of it is there are no bodies there. There were no parents looking for missing kids at the school, which you might have expected if they kind of went missing. This thing's basically like a Pizzagate level hoax, but this is a hoax that has been endorsed by all the major political parties, all the mainstream media, except for the right-wing paper called the National Post. That has still not been walked back. I mean, the mainstream media is now trying to memory hole those claims, but they're not contradicting those claims. They're not saying it didn't happen. And only a few brave politicians who've been ousted from the Conservative Party in British Columbia have actually said there were no mass graves. I'm calling the emperor has no clothes here. But that has gripped the entire elite class, the entire society. It is a myth. It's a hoax. It's ridiculous, but nobody's willing to call it ridiculous because you would then have to go against the testimony of some Indigenous people, which means you would have to violate the claims of a sacred minority. And this is really where we are with woke, is that once you erect groups as sacred, then you can't contradict them in any way.
So I remember when that story broke, and then it was like, okay, what's the evidence for this again? Well, it's this ground penetrating radar, and then it's like, okay, can we see this? And it's like, well, if you look if you squint and use your imagination, you can sort of see that might be a great. It's like, has this been peer reviewed, like in an archaeology journal, or people that use this technology and know what they're looking at? No.
No. Oh, I should add one thing, however, was that there was then a move which then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was endorsing to make denial of this hoax a crime.
Oh my God.
So, this would have been residential school denialism, and they wanted to make it a hate crime. I mean, that's how crazy the country is. It's it's still pretty awful, but it's maybe not as bad as when Trudeau was in. But once you allow these kind of sacred values to be the highest value and to trump free speech and the pursuit of truth, you're in trouble.
Yeah. All right, let's go through the four main aims of your book. 1, arguing against the prevailing view that a cultural form of Marxism or postmodernism corrupted liberalism. Rather than a purposeful Gramscian Marxist march through the institutions, I maintain that modern liberals, not radicals, are largely responsible for our cultural malaise.
Yeah, so, there are a number of books like Chris Rufo's, America's Cultural Revolution, James Lindsay, Race Marxism, that make this point, which I don't disagree with. Look, there are these intellectual pointy heads who have these meta theories, and there is a connection between Angela Davis and Herbert Marcuse's critical race theory and, BLM and present-day critical race theory. That's all true. But do I think that's what's led us to the problem where we are now? No, I would argue more along the lines of Gad Saad in his upcoming book, where he talks about suicidal empathy, right? So we have this template amongst left liberals, which really combines guilt, white guilt, for example, empathy towards historically marginalized race, gender, sex groups, with this exaggerated fear of racism and fascism. And that very simple kind of emotional makeup, majorities bad, minorities good. That's a simple emotional reflex. Everything beyond that is kind of a post hoc an intellectual rationalization. So if you're an intellectual who is selling critical race theory about oppressor-oppressed matrices of white supremacy and patriarchy, these structures, hidden, invisible structures operating on people's minds and you can't see it, you can't measure it, but it's there. That argument is going to work because it's working on white guilt and what I call fascist scare, this idea that we're always one moment away from 1933 or Jim Crow. It'll work because you're working with an emotional substrate that's already there. My argument, therefore, is that this emotional substrate amongst well-meaning liberals, not revolutionaries. These are people who just, they want to be nice. They feel guilty. They're a bit fearful of fascists. That makeup of the left liberal, which is really the dominant group in academia, is this soft liberal, left liberal type, evolutionary. They don't want a radical revolution to tear down society. There are a lot of revolutionaries, but they're not the majority. That group can be persuaded by a lot of these woke arguments. So you have to look at the reception of these ideas. I also liken it a bit to the amplifier. The guitarist might be Herbert Marcuse or Ibram X. Kendi, but you need to plug that into the amplifier, which is really this left liberal substrate, which really these ideas really resonate with. And so I kind of put the emphasis very much on this suicidal empathy, this overreach of this idea. So if you think about Ibram X. Kendi, he's a sort of what Lindsay would call a race Marxist. He wants perfect equality. He wants a sort of amendment to the Constitution that mandates equal outcomes. Okay, that's fine. That's a very race Marxist point of view. But what do you do with somebody who says, well, we're just too male, we're too pale, so we just need more diversity. But no diversity is ever enough. It's always more. We need to be more. We're too white. We're too Eurocentric. They're not actually a revolutionary. They just want more incremental change. But that incrementalism leads you towards essentially the same place that the cultural Marxists are. And so I just think, and the other thing about those left liberals is they put a lot of emphasis on the therapeutic, this idea that not making people feel bad, the self-esteem, emotional safety, trigger warnings, that's the traumas, that kind of language isn't really there in Marxism at all. And so I just think that second part, this therapeutic left liberalism, is the bigger part of the story. It's why, a majority, 51% of Seattle citizens endorsed defund the police. That's not coming from a place of having read Marcuse and Derek Bell and Ibram X. Kendi. It's really much more visceral than that. It's that they're just persuaded by their white guilt and their exaggerated fear of fascism.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. I read Chris Rufo's book. I really liked it. I love all that intellectual history. It's kind of what I do.
Right.
But tracking a causal vector from, decades ago of some intellectual like Gramsci or Marx or something to the current protesters. If you went yesterday down to the No Kings March here in Santa Barbara and said, you're being very Gramscian in your like,
Right.
what? What are you talking about? I'm just pissed off about something.
Right. Yeah. I think that the sacredness of race, for example, Shelby Steele, his book White Guilt, I think really gets to the heart of the matter, right?
Yeah.
Which is it's something much, all these complicated critical theories and postmodernism and all of that this is not where this starts. This starts with something much simpler, white guilt. You can explain a lot through white guilt and its manipulation. And BLM and defund the police, in a way, I think white guilt gets us a lot closer to the explanation than Angela Davis and critical theory. I just think it's the receptivity. And one of the problems is even though the excesses of defund the police and the excesses perhaps of the trans activist movement have been reined in, I think we've still got a problem because until we tame white guilt and we tame the exaggerated fear of fascism, the exaggerated fear that conservatives just want to get us back to Jim Crow and gays in the closet and women in the home. Until we start to say, actually, can we be a bit more critical about those emotional impulses? Can you actually be a bit more reflective about them? And can we rebalance the public morality away from just being based on anti-racism, anti-sexism to but we're still going to care about those things, but we also have to care about, free speech and reason and cohesion and beauty and truth. And we have to have a trade-off between all that. Sometimes there are going to be tensions and trade-offs, and we have to do what's in the interest of the flourishing of society, not what's just in the narrow interests of anti-racism and anti-sexism, however defined.
Yeah. Yeah, I also think there's something of a continuity in liberals' minds between the past and the present. We went through civil rights, women's rights, gay rights. So trans, progressive, woke, right? Well, that's the next one. I should be in favor of that.
Well, yeah, that's right. The trans, because it links up to sexual orientation and feminism, that's where it's a natural, it fits well within the woke pantheon, right? The problem, of course, I would still say there's a problem with the anti-racism and anti-sexism part insofar as racism and sexism as words have been stretched out of all proportion, inflated to mean. So, for example, mispronouncing someone's name becomes racist, right? So there are all kinds of things. Going hiking becomes racist because there's too many white people. We can go through lots of examples of how these terms are simply stretched. Another example might be being worried about crime, being worried about illegal immigration, because that it might be seen as offensive to a member of a minority group because maybe they're disproportionately represented amongst people in jail or people who are coming across the border, that somehow that's racist, right? So we have to shut down that conversation. One of the points in the book is the culture war is not just about the culture war, about culture. If you can't have a conversation about immigration because that's seen as racism or crime because that's seen as racism, then you're going to have lax border policies, lax crime policies that are going to lead to all kinds of blowback, all kinds of effects. And I think that's part of this, is that the culture war is also about these downstream effects on very real world things: education, crime, immigration, polarization. All of that stuff is in some ways an outcome of the culture not being in some way balanced. I think this imbalance in the elite culture is having all of these downstream effects that are reverberating through the society. So we have to get control and balance back in the culture before we can start to fix some of these other problems.
A couple passages from your book I pulled out. In a famous 2015 paper, political scientists Shanto Iyengar and Sean Westwood found that race played essentially no role in how players in a game allocated awards to each other. But political affiliation, such as Democrat or Republican, had a massive effect. Partisan affiliation is no longer just important at election time, but affects non-political decisions about where to live, whom to marry, where to work, or even which beer to buy. No Bud Light.
Right.
And then another example of this is in your section saying polarization has become a problem. 2016 and 2020, the American National Election Study showed that liberals and conservatives, or Republicans and Democrats, generally feel about 35 to 40 points warmer on a 0 to 100 thermometer toward their party than they do the other party. While Democrats underestimate the share of Republicans who think racism still exists in America by nearly 30 points, Republicans underestimate the proportion of Democrats who say, I am proud to be an American, by an equivalent amount. Opinion bubbles insulate political prejudice from reality. So talk about that is the new problem now.
Well, yeah, I think the political prejudice, partisanship, the U.S., it's most extreme. I mean, there's versions of that also in European countries as well. I mean, what you see now, of course, polarization has been building since the 1980s in the U.S. gradually. That's been measured by political scientists. What we are facing now is a problem of political discrimination, people in filter bubbles who don't ever encounter the other opinion. Now, where are those filter bubbles most extreme now? I think I would argue that highly educated liberals live in some of the most politically homogenous environments. Poorly educated, high school educated liberals actually, and this More in Common study showed this, didn't have as large a misperception about the other side because they knew them as relatives and as friends and so on. As we're getting this sorting, which has been documented by geographers and political scientists, there are more landslide counties that always break heavily for one part or the other. Whereas this sort of urban super zips are overwhelmingly Democrats in Washington. I can't remember how heavily Washington, D.C. went for the Democrats. I mean, it is some ridiculous level. I can't remember what it is, but it's very, very extreme. So you're getting more extreme political geographies. But the other thing I would say is that amongst the educated and amongst young people, the prejudice against the right is now considerably worse than the right's prejudice against the left. So if you take a question like, would you date somebody who happens to be a Donald Trump supporter or a Republican? If you take FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, does a massive survey of American students. Only 7%, 7 out of 100, who didn't vote for Trump, women who didn't vote for Trump, said they would date a man who was a Trump supporter. Similarly, if we go to Britain and we ask people who voted to remain in the European Union whether they would hire, whether they would date, someone who voted to leave the European Union, we find the prejudice levels, certainly among young people, to be several orders of magnitude higher on the left than on the right. I think this gets at one of the issues, which is this idea that if you are on the right, you are morally fallen, you are evil, not just wrong, or stupid, but evil. I think that perception is simply stronger on the left. We also there is some sort of survey data that would suggest that that's rooted in the belief that people on the right are racist and sexist and homophobic. So they are more likely to be implicated in the cardinal sins of our left liberal moral order. And so if you ask, young people, those who think that, white Republicans are racist, who will agree to that statement, are more likely to say people who disagree with me politically are immoral, to agree with that statement, which almost half of young white liberals did in this particular survey. So they're moralizing, they're turning political questions into questions of good and evil. And your opinions about politics are now a reflection of your character as an individual. You're either a good person or an evil person. That kind of thinking, I think, really just leads to really where we are now. I mean, you can't possibly reason with such an individual who's put you into the evil camp. It's over. But I think this has its roots in the making sacred of these values around anti-racism, anti-sexism. There's no nuance at all when discussing these topics. And the stretching of the definition, if you think immigration needs to be controlled, you're a racist. If you think crime is a problem, you're right. So there are all these ways in which the meaning of these terms is not what you and I would think it is, but something vastly inflated. And so, getting out of this cul-de-sac, I have to say, I certainly think that there are plenty of MAGA conservatives who clearly have a very blinkered view of what Democrats think. But equally, I think that particularly when we look at our dominant institutions and who's powerful in setting the tone in those institutions, I think there is a huge problem on the left that they need to face up to the irrationality and the sacred values that really lie at the basis of their belief system.
Yeah, that's really insightful, because if you watch just general media, you'll hear the right being described as evil, but the left being described as useful idiots or retards or morons.
Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, there is a certain irrationality on both sides. I mean, the right's irrationality, there are certain sacred values on the right, around, it might be around, government or government is evil. I'm trying to think of which, maybe the election was stolen, whatever it is, or there are maybe vaccines. There may be certain things which the right is irrational about, or at least certain sections of the right are irrational. On the left, it's really around those sacred values of race, gender, sexuality that really interfere with straight thinking and drop the IQ points. Anytime you get near to those centers of radioactivity, it seems that a lot of left liberals just can't think straight. And there's no better illustration of that than the mass graves hoax in Canada. I think that tells you really that it is impossible for somebody who is on the cultural left to think straight about questions that touch on sacred groups. And whereas on the right, maybe the problem is more around, with MAGA, around election being stolen or maybe around vaccines or government, or maybe these are the areas where the right has problems, maybe around religion, but equally on the left, we have got problems as well. And we've got authoritarianism on both sides. For a long time, academia was pretending there's only right-wing authoritarianism, but we've now had a few brave academics, including Luke Conway, who was at the conference. In his book, Liberal Bullies, he really outlines the psychological research on left-wing authoritarianism and how actually it's just as prevalent as the right-wing variety.
What about woke right? Is that a thing?
That's a whole so my view is I take a kind of social science approach. I always say, look, this is not about me, whether I think there are plenty of people on the right who are acting in an identitarian, grievance-fueled, tone policing manner. My problem is that, and I'd say the same thing about those who want to include, for example, views on climate change as being woke or views on vaccines. I think there are family resemblances. So yes, if you have the wrong view on climate change in academia, you will be ostracized. You may even be forced out of a job. Those are family resemblances to the idea of woke and cancel culture, but that doesn't mean it's the same concept. I use the example of a bat and a bird. They both fly, they're both kind of small. That doesn't mean a bat is a bird. And so when it comes to woke right, yeah, of course, there are groups on the right that have, on many dimensions, are similar to woke leftists, but not on all dimensions. One of the key differences, I would say, is that if you take the idea of the woke left, it's moralistic, so it's about you are a bad person. What they call the woke right is, oh, you're a bad Republican, you're a bad conservative. That's not the same thing. You're a bad member of the tribe. Okay, you can leave the tribe. No one's saying that your character at its core is rotten and you're an evil person. Whereas on the left, they would say, you don't hold the right beliefs on race and gender and sexuality. You're an evil person and you must be cast out, debanked. We can't date you. We can't work for you. That's a very different approach than this so-called woke right. So I think the woke right's a misnomer. What I would say is, yeah, there are people who have a family resemblance to woke on the right, but I think use of the term woke right is an example of what the methodological stickler Giovanni Sartori, the political scientist, calls conceptual stretching. It's just a sort of a faux pas. in taxonomy. So I just think this is a faux pas, even if there are family resemblances between the woke left and elements of the right.
Nice. All right, let me read 2 more studies from your book, and then this will take us into the solutions and kind of wrap up here. What can we do about this? All right, as Harvard's own newspaper showed, using FEC contributions data, 96% of faculty donations went to Democrats between 2011 and 2014, and 99% between 2017 and 2020. This monoculture shapes friendships. In a 2022 Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE, survey of nearly 1,500 academics, American academics, 48% of those on the left said that all or almost all of their friends had the same party identification or leaning as they did, compared to 8% of right-wing academics. Wow. Okay, second one from Cass Sunstein, who's done a lot of interesting research on effects of polarization. He cites a study that shows that on a 3-person judicial panel, where 2 votes is all that is needed for a victory, those where all 3 judges are from the same party render more extreme decisions. A two-person majority is enough to carry the win, but dissenters offer viewpoint diversity, which checks extremism. On the other hand, the incentive in monocultural settings is to riff off each other, convincing one other of the righteousness of our point of view, while hearing no counter-arguments that might challenge radicalism. Political extremism thrives in monocultural spaces, which subsequently attract zealots. Okay, I agree. But we don't want the government forcing Harvard to hire more conservative political professors, right? I mean, that doesn't seem like the right solution. But it always makes me nervous when people say, we need to like Rufo, we need the government to come in and fix this. Like, whoa, okay, wait a minute.
Well, it depends, right? I mean, even David French, a sort of liberal, like a classical liberal like him, will agree that, for example, if the government says universities can't censor the speech of and fire academics and students for speech, he has no problem with that because it's reinforcing liberal values. And so here in Britain, something I was involved in was the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which essentially does that. Essentially allows you to appeal around your university if it's trying to force you out as a staff member or student. So that's the first thing: is universities have already regulated by government in many ways, including civil rights law, for example.
That's true.
I don't think government regulation of universities is in principle a problem. Now, the question of viewpoint diversity. Okay, so why are universities so monocultural? Now, I think the main thing is the direction of elite culture is very much moved in the cultural left direction for the past, since the 60s. And, university academics, initially social scientists, but now many academics, even in STEM, hold cultural left beliefs and identify with the Democrats. I think that's been a drift in the culture. We're seeing it now in law and medicine and other fields. That's the main reason, but I also think there is political discrimination. So in surveys I've done, roughly 40% of American academics, this was before Trump 2.0, basically 40% said they wouldn't hire a known Trump supporter for a job, or revealed that they wouldn't hire a known Trump supporter. So you actually have quite a bit of political discrimination, and there are plenty of episodes, in Harvard's case, Roland Fryer, for example, more or less being, driven out, Carol Hooven for her views on gender, Fryer's view on police shootings, which is meticulous research. Clearly, there's enormous conformity that goes on and enormous political prejudice from peers. That is definitely shaping this monoculture. And now, what do you do about that? I guess one thing that I would favor, where I've advocated, something called equivalent action, which would say, okay, anything you do for race and sex, you got to match for political beliefs. So if you want to monitor the race and sex of your faculty, you got to monitor the political beliefs of your faculty to say how many Democrats and Republicans do we have. If you want to broaden your intake by trying to, expand the pipeline to get more Black and Hispanic pupils, you got to do the same for Republicans. That would kind of introduce a discipline, a natural check on either excessive DEI on race and sex, because then you wouldn't want to have to do that for Republicans, or likewise, it would bring in the viewpoint diversity. I think you're right. It's inconsistent for the Trump administration to say you can't do DEI on race and sex, but you must do DEI for conservatives. Clearly, that's not principled and consistent. However, I would say that, I do think government has a role, and I'm kind of agreeing with Chris Rufo in this, that I think if they are funding through student loans and through research grants and in other ways, these institutions, I think the public has a right to say, we're not going to fund certain things. So my view on this is to say, if you're at Harvard and you want to teach and study critical race theory, even though it is borderline blood libel, fine. You can do that. You can teach that. I wouldn't ban this stuff. But I would say it's legitimate for the government to say, we're not going to fund it. So that's the difference between, I think it's legitimate for the government to say, we won't fund these particular things, to have a content-based approach to what we will fund. I don't think it's a restriction on freedom of the autonomy of universities. They're always welcome to cross-subsidize their critical race theory course from funds from the business school. But I think it just creates downward pressure. And so they're always going to say, do we really want to be cross-subsidizing these courses, which the government's telling us are not approved of by the public? I think that's the right balance to strike. But I don't think this idea that that universities must have their autonomy, governments can't infringe. In fact, governments have infringed on university autonomy in many ways, including civil rights and Title IX. But even if you look at forcing the desegregation of Ole Miss, and saying you can't have a whites-only admissions policy, well, likewise, you can't have a admissions policy that discriminates against whites is an extension of that same principle. So I don't think that those are unreasonable. I do think, though, that the Trump administration has kind of gone, instead of a scalpel, they used a sledgehammer and they've thrown the baby of good research out with the bathwater of awful politicized scholar activism. I think you could have been a lot more forensic, but I wouldn't say no to government involvement.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good argument. I tend to side with just going from the bottom up through intellectual arguments and so on, stuff that you and I do writing books. But obviously we do need that. I think it was Helen Joyce that made the point. We're not asking for new legislation, just remove the legislation from the top that favors, race or sex instead of the more neutral system that is more rational, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, clearly there's problems with the civil rights laws, the equality laws. I think, the Trump administration has done good work in repealing, for example, rescinding the 65 affirmative action executive order and that. But even if you didn't have those civil rights laws on the books, I still think that herd opinion and that the power of woke and the ability of them to police speech and tone police in these institutions would mean that of their own volition, these institutions would engage in racial discrimination, would engage in suppression of speech, because I just think there's enough people who believe in it. So, for example, something like mandatory diversity statements, having to pledge allegiance to DEI, that is supported by a majority of left-wing academics. Now, that majority has shrunk. It seems to have gone down from 2/3 to close to 50%, but it's not the case that this is simply something that a few radicals and DEI commissars have forced on a reluctant professoriate. That's a bit of a myth. Actually, the professoriate been pretty keen on a lot of this stuff, and they've been pretty keen on even affirmative action. Universities, they've interpreted affirmative action and DEI in a maximalist way that's not necessarily mandated by law. So I don't fully agree with Richard Hanania and Chris Caldwell on this. I think, yes, you've had these civil rights laws, but just pure compliance is not the reason. I think there's been ideological fervor that has really stretched and pushed the DEI crusade.
Nice. All right. Last question. Are you optimistic? You had Andrew Doyle speak at your conference. The end of woke. It's over, which is a bit optimistic, I think.
Yeah.
Or more prescriptive than descriptive. But what are your thoughts on going forward?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, woke isn't over. I mean, I think that, certain indicators like in the elite culture, corporate DEI, 140 universities have declared themselves politically neutral. There's more willingness to talk about viewpoint diversity again, and this is the trustees and the university presidents, editors of the New York Times. So these elite actors, the senior liberals, I think there's been a shift there that's very positive. But if you look at public opinion, only on the trans issue has there been a big change. On affirmative action, actually, the numbers have not subsided since the Great Awakening. Not that it's only about 30% of Americans that support affirmative action, but still, it's not dropping. So on some indicators, woke is not abating. On other indicators, it is abating. I do think that's somewhat positive, but I think saying the end of woke is premature. And certainly outside the U.S., there's been almost no movement away from total woke domination in the institutions. What do we do? I think we've just got. I actually think that I do think that government action, and I mentioned that in the book. A number of different solutions. I mean, one is these questions in a democracy, they have to be decided in the political process. The more they are hidden behind closed doors in institutions, the more the cultural revolution can continue against the wishes of a majority. So I think we need to have these issues politicized. We need them to decide elections. And we need governments to be entering and cracking into institutions like the way Trump is doing with government, the way DeSantis has done with the schools, in order to make those institutions resemble the rest of society. They can't just kind of proceed with their cultural revolution, heedless of the views of the majority of the population. So that's the core of it. Now, the only way we get these cultural issues to be high salience is to have brave politicians. But and I'm very critical of Trump in the way he's done this, the sort of inflammatory, uncivil way, unprincipled way. But we do need politicians. I would like to see someone who is an ethical individual who can lead a kind of moral crusade against DEI on a principled grounds, that this is discriminatory, that it is anti-enlightenment, it is bad for society. But I think we have to reform the institutions. There's no way around that. And one of the things you do notice is that ever since DeSantis and Trump attack on critical race and gender ideology in schools and government and universities, you're actually now seeing an opening up of minds. I actually think a genuine shift of some minds, certainly at the elite level in universities, perhaps in newspapers. And that suggests that, and this was an idea that Tocqueville had, is that where you had checks and balances and multiple power centers competing, that was actually the best environment to be a spur to free speech and to open minds up. And so I think one of the outcomes of Trump's, crusade against universities and DEI has actually been to force some people in the middle to change their minds a little bit. So to some degree, culture is downstream of politics, and you needed a rival power center to collide with the big beast, the power center of the universities, to break it open. And that's actually freed some minds to think, actually, was this really so wise of us to pursue this? And likewise, Trump, when he campaigns on the trans issue at election time, and when the Democrats lose on that issue, that again forces open some minds in the center, and particularly the center left, the Noah Smith, Matthew Iglesias, they can push a little bit and say, or the Young Turks, they can say, look, this is killing us. We've got to get away from these very unpopular ideas. And that's just a way of possibly shifting the needle, changing people's minds. So I do think, actually, one of the points where I might disagree with some people who are classical liberals is I'm a classical liberal, but I'm a classical liberal, what I would say a classical liberal realist that is as much Hobbes and Locke as James Madison. I'm not one of these people who thinks government is always evil and always the problem. Sometimes private censorship, private institutional censorship is a bigger problem than government censorship. It just depends. That's something that Hobbes and Locke recognize, that sometimes government actually can protect liberty. And so I'm still a liberal, but I think we've got to be realistic that, when you allow institutions to do what they want, very easily they can become corrupt if they are composed of bad actors or ideologies. So kind of classical liberal realism just takes into account the fact that, we have to look at how people actually behave. And that means we can't be so utopian in this idea of hands off and small government. Sometimes you need to use government.
Yeah.
But of course, that also carries a danger. Absolutely, Madison was right. You need to, all of these things have to be optimized. You can't go all in on one or all in on the other.
End this by reading from your final page here. Just as a winning team confers benefits, even on weaker players and fans in the cheap seats, defending mainstream meritocratic structures benefits everyone, including disadvantaged outsiders. Protecting and enhancing our cultural wealth is vital if we are to produce the common goods that everyone, including the marginal, can enjoy. All right, let's do it. Thanks, Eric. Thanks for your work. Thanks for the book. Thanks for everything. I would say you're doing God's work, but I'm an atheist, so you're doing something really good for
that's high
objective
praise.
Values.
That's high praise from an atheist. But Michael, it's been a pleasure, and it was great to meet you also in Buckingham.
Oh yeah, that was great. No, it was big fun.